Welcome to the Personal Tanya, day 54 for the 16th day of Shvat. We're going to explain today in the Tanya how all sins, we have explained how all sins equally cut us off from God. But today we're going to explain that even though different sins have differences in when they can be violated and how they impact our souls and how our souls are cleansed from the stains of different sins. Even though there are differences, nevertheless, all sins are equal in how they cut us off from God. On a side note, we're also going to touch on the theme of exile, of an internal exile of our soul, how our godly soul is forced to cooperate against its will with the animal soul when it's engaging in sin. And that's going to become an important theme later in Tanya when it comes to manifesting and expressing love for God. So the Tanya begins today with a question. If all our sins are equal when it comes to separating from God, then why are there different degrees of severity of sins? Shouldn't all sins be equal? For example, we are allowed to violate some sins in order to save a life. For example, we're allowed to violate Shabbat, but we're not allowed to violate idolatry to save a life. However, and another example is when forced. If someone's forcing you to sin, you're allowed to violate all sins except for three: idolatry, adultery, and murder. So clearly there are degrees of sins and not one size fits all. In Tanya today, we explain that this distinction is external and it's not relevant to the quality of the sin because all sins equally cut us off from God. For example, how we see that this is external is that Shabbos may be violated only in order to allow him to observe more Shabbos in the future. So the Alter Rebbe explains that these distinctions are not logical. They're actually a divine decree, unique to each case, just to put this into the proper perspective with an example. So a ritual slaughterer, a shochet, is not allowed to be an idolater and is not allowed to be somebody that violates the Shabbos, but he may be a sexual offender, like somebody who commits adultery, let's say, which seems to indicate that adultery is less severe than other sins. But when faced with a situation where one is forced to sin, you're allowed to violate Shabbos, but you're not allowed to violate adultery, indicating that adultery is more severe. So clearly, it's not a logical sequence or categorizing of sins. All sins are equal in how they cut us off from God. In other words, when it comes to slaughtering, Shabbos is more severe than adultery. When it comes to life safety, adultery is more severe than Shabbos. So clearly, it's a divine decree. It's not a distinction in the severity of the sin. And the reason for the various degrees of sins is either because of a divine decree or because of what we're about to learn, the degrees of disconnect, the differences in how they impact our soul, how they hurt our soul, and therefore the punishment and the consequence of the sin that remains afterwards. Today's Tanya also introduces us to a fascinating concept about punishment, redefining punishment, how it's not really about retribution, but rather it's about therapy for the soul and cleansing for staining the soul through sin. The deeper the stain, the more thorough is the healing process. And that explains the reason for Gehinnom, for purgatory, as well as human suffering in this world. The Alter Rebbe says in today's Tanya that it's because of the therapy and the healing of the stain that we have caused upon our souls through the sin. When it comes to a sin, there are different degrees of separation that are impacted with our soul, separating from God. So, for example, for our animal soul disconnects from God when it sins with a regular sin that's not called a kares sin. A kares sin is a sin of cutting off. So, a sin of kares is a sin that actually separates the soul from God entirely, and the soul is in a state of death until such time as it does teshuvah. But after concluding a sin which is not punishable by kares, by amputation from God, a regular sin, the soul does actually arise back to its natural state of connection to God after concluding the sin. Nevertheless, during the time of the sin, Tanya tells us that the godly soul is in incredible pain. The godly soul is being taken hostage as it's forced to cooperate with the animal soul. And this is the definition of golus, of exile. The analogy given is like the head of the king, which is forced into, where you might grab the head of the king and put it into a filthy toilet bowl, which is obviously an absolute disgrace, even for a short time. When you have control over the godly soul within you, The godly soul is in exile within you, and you make the choice to do a sin. You're taking that godly soul that's tethered with you, the peace of God in you, and you're putting the head of the king inside of the toilet bowl. As powerful as we see, as we are when it comes to the sin impacting our godly soul, it's also incredibly inspiring to see the converse of how connected we are, even at our lowest moments, even when we're sinning. We're taking the head of the king and putting it in the toilet bowl because we still have the head of the king with us. And ultimately, we are always capable of redemption. We are always capable of teshuvah, because sin is an unnatural state of being. If you sinned, it's not too late to repair the dysfunction. And this concludes today's Tanya, where we're ending it off by saying that despite the differences between the various sins, all sins cut us off from God. And therefore, we have to be very, very cognizant and aware of the fact that every single sin is an act of divorce from God. And just like we would do anything, our natural hidden love will prevent us from ever doing anything that would divorce us from God. When we become aware and conscious that every single sin is an act of divorce from God, then we would be empowered by our natural hidden love to be able to stay far away from any sin. And that's what we're going to tie together in tomorrow's Tanya, in chapter 25, where we're going to tie it all together, tie the meditation of the shortcut method to self-mastery. But for today, that's a wrap. You can do this.